Today I'm going to read chapter 4 of the Bloodpines. Sorry, I usually have my phone. I'll start over. Today I'm going to read chapter 4 of the Bloodpines, which I wrote and which is awesome. I'm going to do so while making my lunch, a little bit of mac and cheese, because I need carbs. Clearly, that's what I'm lacking. Now, if you remember, we just did 2 chapters with James and Common. So we're going back to Parr. Parr was from chapter 1. Abner's. Do you know what? Just keep up, guys. Chapter 4. Parr spent most of Saturday curled up in the loft above the coat hall, reading in a single shaft of sunlight that came through a hole in the plank wall. Once the sun dropped down behind the trees at the side of the schoolyard, it became too difficult to read, and Parr was very protective of his eyes. He knew his mother would never be able to afford anything so frivolous as eyeglasses. He could have lit a candle, but there was a different, more immediate danger in that. He didn't like his chances of escaping unharmed were he to set the schoolhouse on fire. Parr had always, for as long as he could remember, been afraid of fire. He figured it came with the territory when part of you was made of wood. He always dreaded the winter months when it seemed like everywhere he went he faced a roaring fire. The fact that keeping a fire inside your home was not only accepted, but expected, seemed like pure insanity. Whenever he faced the prospect of attending dinner in someone else's home, which was frequent, as his mother was the school teacher, and folks weren't above trying to get on her good side if it meant better marks for their children, he would make sure to sit as close to the door as possible. His mother knew nothing of his phobia, and would have made quite a lot of it if she had. We're okay. Parr was very good at keeping secrets, but not by choice. He would have shared his fear of fire, as well as his secret loft, but he had no one to share with. He had no friends. He liked to think that it was due to his missing leg, that others were frightened of his handicap, but deep down he knew it was because he drove people away. Every time someone tried to be friendly, he found ways to chase them away. He could be awfully mean when he wanted to be. It never occurred to him that he had anything to offer anyone. He would say that people only knew him as an unlovable, skinny, one-legged boy, but he would have been surprised to realize that he mostly thought of himself in the same terms. The only reason he could fathom for another person treating him kindly was out of pity, and he wasn't having any of that. This wasn't a huge issue for him, as the line of people volunteering to be his friend was not long. In the 7 years since he'd lost his father and his leg, Parr had encountered fewer than a dozen individuals who went out of their way to be kind to him. 2 in particular stood out in his memory. James Lester, widely known to be an idiot, so hardly an ego boost that one, and Mariah Hen. Mariah was in grade 3 when Parr started grade 1, but they had gotten along almost immediately. She was beautiful and smart and funny, and she didn't seem at all bothered by his missing leg. She would often tell him how adorable he was, and whenever their eyes met, a jolt ran right through him. As they grew older, Parr must have grown less adorable, because Mariah failed to acknowledge him more and more. And then, having finished grade 8, she left. Very few students continued beyond grade 8, as the higher grades didn't learn practical knowledge. Parr believed with complete certainty that Mariah Hen would stay through year 12, and then go off for 6 months of formal training at Mercy House, just like his mother had done, before returning to take over as teacher. And from there, his daydreams spiraled into wild fantasies, where he would stay on as a humble handyman, building a small library off the back of the schoolhouse to be named in Miss Hen's honor. And she would see him no longer as an adorable one-legged widow's son, but as a man deserving so much more than simple passing notice. Hang on. Okay, it's not boiling yet. We're good. We got a few minutes. Do I have it on? It's on. No. Whoop. Everything's fine. Calm down. Mariah Hen didn't stay on after 8th grade. She was, instead, married off to an elderly merchant 2 towns over. This kind of thing was not uncommon, but it changed Parr to see Mariah treated like property. It changed the way he saw the adults in town. It changed the way he saw the children, and it changed the way he saw himself. He'd never felt truly helpless before. His missing leg was more of an inconvenience than a handicap, but knowing that Mariah was being sold off to some rich old man and had no say over the situation made him feel completely weak. He couldn't do anything about it, couldn't even say anything about it. He'd be going to battle against Mariah's father, the elderly merchant, years of customs and traditions. he'd have better luck growing a new leg. But his heartache worsened. In the days following her betrothal, Parr overheard Mariah talking to a group of her friends. Parr expected her to be devastated at the thought of being swept away from her home and her friends to live as a trophy for some blistered old fool, but she certainly didn't sound devastated. "His house is more than twice the size of the Downies' house, and there's a separate house where the servants live," she said. "But why do they need their own house?" asked Sissy Hardway. "The servants?" said Mariah, scoffing. "I don't want them sleeping right down the hall from me, would you? Oh, and he's got more than a score of purebred ponies in his stable, and he said I can go out riding any time I like." "You don't even know how to ride," pointed out Jenny Garrett with a hint of bitterness. "I can learn," said Mariah with a wave of her hand. When Mariah began to speculate about her future wardrobe and where her dresses would come from, Parr limped away, confused and heartbroken. He had always thought Mariah was above such pettiness, but it seemed clear that you could never really know anyone. Parr tried not to think about those few people who had attempted to be his friend. Thoughts of Mariah only made him angry, and thoughts of James Lester always made him feel foolish. How had he not noticed when they were in school together that the boy's brain was addled? What did that say about his own brain? There was something odd about James, though. Every now and then, Parr would see him around town, and sometimes their eyes would meet. Parr would try to see something in those eyes, either recognition or the lack of intelligence for which he was so famous. Once Parr was in the general and feed collecting a few items his mother had ordered when the door opened, and there stood James, blinking in the dimness of the shop, letting his eyes adjust. Mr. Pratt, the shopkeep, hurried forward with his hands stretched out in front of him. "No, no, no, son, you can't be in here. Not without your folks. Store policy." James looked Mr. Pratt square in the face for a moment, and then looked over the man's shoulder at Parr, standing alone at the counter, waiting to collect his order. James's eyes twinkled, but he just hung his head and nodded and shuffled back out the door. There are definitely things going on inside that big head, Parr thought. Things that would surprise most folks. It was Saturday evening, the day before the Bloodpine Jubilee. Parley Burnham lowered himself gently down from the secret loft above the coat hall. His mother was likely resting in the small boarding room they shared above the schoolhouse. He hadn't heard her climbing the stairs, but she was crafty and could move like a cat when she wanted to. Parr was not a troublesome boy. He was not loud. He was not combative. He did not talk back. He offered very little resistance of any kind when it came to his mother, because he knew, may have been the only one in town who did, that his mother was not quite right. He didn't think anyone else would have noticed, but there was something wrong with her eyes. They were often out of focus. And she said things sometimes that seemed directed at people who weren't in the room, or even, Parr shivered to remember, alive. A year ago, she had shouted out in anger, "This is not something I'm willing to discuss, Abner," before slamming her hand on her desktop. It was during the school day, but the students, thankfully, were all outside having lunch. Only Parr was around to hear his mother's outburst, of which she herself didn't seem aware. He never mentioned it to her. As time passed, she seemed to grow worse. Soon, Parr wouldn't be the only one noticing. Madness isn't the kind of illness you can hide for very long. His mother's madness was like his wooden leg, he thought, except that instead of it getting too small, it was getting too big. Parr sat in the coat hall with his pants pooled around his ankles, fitting the wooden leg over his stump. He pulled at the straps, trying to stretch them longer so he could buckle them in place. He knew it was no use. He knew he only had a few more weeks left with the leg, and then, with no money to buy a new one, what would he do? Move on to crutches? The prospect darkened his heart. He imagined lurching through the door at the General and Feed, pausing to let his eyes adjust to the dark, and having Mr. Pratt tell him that it was store policy that no one was allowed in the store without 2 legs. With his mother losing more and more of her mind each day, soon it would fall entirely on his shoulders to support them both. What kind of job would he be able to get with no education, 1 leg, and a pair of crutches? There was nothing he could do or say to anyone in town to make them believe he was capable of performing even the most basic task. With a supreme effort, Parr buckled the strap across his thigh. He dragged his pants up and made his way painfully out of the coat hall onto the front step of the schoolhouse. He looked toward the setting sun and saw between it and himself the banners hanging from the gaslights along the street. Jubilee. An excuse for everyone to eat too much, drink too much, dance too much. Prior to her madness, Grace Burnham had once described the Bloodpine Jubilee as an exercise in discovering new regrets. The bacchanal began in the mid-morning and would continue until well after the sun had set. There were contests of all kind, testing everything from baking prowess to one's proficiency in stone throwing. But the big event was the most ironic: the log chop. The log chop was exactly what it sounded like. Several logs were hauled into town and placed on blocks. Then there was a contest to see who could chop through their log the fastest. It was supposed to be a symbolic revisiting of the town's menfolk to their own walk to the Bloodpines, although Parr suspected that very few of them had ever used an axe in their lives. Parr hated the idea of the Bloodpines, hated the Jubilee, hated the pie-baking contests, the stone-throwing contests, the spelling bee, though he had won it 3 years ago. He hated that he lived in a town whose only test of manhood was, when you boil it down, walking, which everyone did, all day, every day. Something that came easy to everyone but him. If I could make the walk to the Bloodpines, he thought, I could prove to this whole town that I'm just as good as everyone else. I could get a job and support both Mother and myself. It was a fleeting thought, but it lingered. As he washed his face and arms in the rain barrel, the thought continued to ripple. While he was laying out cold ham and bread for dinner, the thought began to bubble. And as he sat at the table in silence, watching his mother look around, trying to make sense of the plates and the food, the thought boiled up into something like hope. He wanted to share the idea with his mother, hoping she would either give him the encouragement he needed to carry it through, or talk him out of it. But he kept it to himself. He could see by the way his mother's eyes pointed slightly outward that she wasn't going to hear a word he said. Parr wasn't aware that he'd made up his mind to go until he was in the cellar. He lit a lantern and moved aside several boxes, mostly old textbooks, until he uncovered a trunk. It contained what little remained of his father's possessions. There was a weathered leather hat on top. It had a wide, flat brim and a rooster feather in the band. Parr's stomach tightened at the sudden surge of memories the hat inspired. "Daddy, why did you put that feather in your hat?" he had asked once. "You don't like my feather?" Abner Burnham had responded playfully. "It's just an old rooster feather. You should get an eagle feather." "Well, I'm not much of an eagle myself. Wouldn't want to be accused of rising above my station," Abner said. "But you're not much of a rooster either." "Oh, am I not?" "No, roosters are common and dirty." "Now, what on earth makes you think there's anything wrong with being common? One of my dearest friends is common." Parr put the hat, and the ache that came with it, aside, and lifted out a few bundles of clothes to reveal what he had come looking for. His father's hatchet. It was the hatchet Abner had carried on his own walk to the Bloodpines. Not the traditional silver that most boys carried, but solid, honest iron. A useful tool, and not just an ornament. He tucked the hatchet into his belt and returned everything else to the trunk. He closed the lid and fastened the latches, shoving the trunk back into its dark corner and replacing the boxes he had moved to uncover it. He turned to go, but his father's hat caught his eye. It was still lying on the floor. Parr picked it up and turned it over, noticing the sweat stains inside. His father's sweat. Parr placed the hat reverently on his own head, relishing the way it slid down over his ears and half covered his eyes. He'd long been nursing a fear that he wasn't the man his father was. The hat confirmed this, but it also assured him that it would be a few years before anyone expected him to be. Parr limped out of the basement, the hat tilted back on his head, the hatchet dragging his pants down on one side. He was a boy dealing with a man's worries. But in a few days, he told himself, he would be a man, and those worries would seem laughable. Time for a flashback. They had fought. Common was tired of being responsible for all of the food, and Abner, who had no idea how or where to set a snare, had stormed off to show Common just how easy it was to find food in the forest. "Everything's food in the forest!" he had yelled. But an hour later, he had found nothing except some mushrooms that looked far too sinister for his liking. When he saw a bird's nest hidden among the leaves above him, he climbed awkwardly up the tree and shimmied out onto the branch, only to discover that the nest was empty and the branch was dead. He found this out when it broke under his weight and he crashed to the ground. He limped back to the road where Common was waiting for him. "Fine. Teach me how to catch food." All right, that's it. Come back soon, hopefully, for Chapter 5. I'm enjoying it. I don't know about you guys, but this is probably the best book I've ever read. Definitely the best book I've ever written. Currently the only book I've ever written. So, thanks for watching. We'll see you very soon.